Welcome to Cultivated Live for Tuesday, March 26th, 2024. I'm Jay Rosenthal, the co-founder of Cultivated Media and the co-host of Cultivated Live. And since we launched, our goal at Cultivated has been to be industry first, providing this lovely cannabis industry with the most important, insightful, and useful information to our audience every day. And we were doing that only through our daily newsletter, which we still love and want you to subscribe to. But about 5 weeks ago, we added this daily live stream on LinkedIn and YouTube, and I think it's going well. On Tuesdays, we are joined by Brad Spirrison, the founder and CEO of Grown In. We like to talk about politics during a segment we like to call United States of Cannabis. Brad, it's sunnier where you are now than where it usually is. Am I wrong?
I am taking a very close look at the Florida State Supreme Court. While I'm not in Tallahassee, I am in Fort Lauderdale and getting a sense of what might be transpiring as soon as Thursday of this week.
Well, we'll talk about that in a bit, but nice to see you. You're wearing short sleeves, even though it's still kind of winter in the north part of the world. But nice to see you. Glad you are here. We're going to get to a bunch of stories we're going to get your thoughts on. You ready for the news?
I can't wait.
The news is interesting today. And the first story is, I'll call it Prohibitionists Are Gearing Up. And we've written, obviously, and you and I have talked about extensively about the march towards cannabis reform at the federal level. But this reform is not without detractors for sure. And a group called the House Republican Policy Committee is urging its members to oppose reform measures likely to come up for a vote in this Congress. This is according to a story in Marijuana Moment. And first, it's a good description of who the House Republican Policy Committee is. It serves as, this is a quote from their website, as an advisory committee to House Republicans and provides a forum for Republican members to discuss legislative proposals and current topics before the House. The committee produces issue backgrounders, of which this was one, and conservative policy solutions to the House Republican Conference. That's a quote from their website. And let's be clear, they're talking about safe banking in one of these. They're talking about a research bill that actually passed. The president hasn't really gone into effect, which we talked about last week. What do you think about House Republican members, or at least sort of thought leaders, gearing up for this? Because it seems to be like, it feels like a punch, like everything's going so great. And now this House Republican Policy Committee is saying, don't do this. But it doesn't mean House members are going to listen to them.
I would look at it as a sign, as the seriousness of the possibility of safe banking actually passing. That the fact that you get the Bill Barrs of the world, they come out, last seen as the AG in the Trump administration, prior to that in the original Bush administration. And I think what we're seeing is a consolidation of opposition, knowing that even though the House, which is now very slimly controlled by the Republicans, might actually be moving in the direction of safer banking. So I don't look at it as necessarily greater opposition against our cause, but more a signal that we might actually get this thing done this year.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the voices you hear opposing these things as they get louder, and I would say, I don't believe this, but they are viewed as very thoughtful policy people and look to on issues like this, that either they think this is a fait accompli and they just want to be on record as opposing it and giving House members who want to oppose it some sort of ammunition, but they actually think it's happening and happening quickly and want to be on record and as again, consolidating the opposition, even though the opposition, I think, is dwindling. But as you mentioned, if you recall, readers of Cultivated will recall what Brad is talking about. Bill Barr and John Walters, who's a former member of the President George W. Bush's cabinet as director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, wrote a piece called "Weed is Dangerous. Legalizing It Was a Mistake." It also read kind of like if my grandfather wrote a piece about weed legalization. It was like, get off my lawn, you. It was a little bit like that. But again, these two things happening in short order, I would expect others to sort of come forward and say we are opposed to this, even though they've counted the votes. Because as we know, I think the latest poll that we've seen, 70% of voters believe that cannabis reform is a good thing. And we'll actually get to a little bit about what the American Bankers Association thinks about it next. Yeah, because I think that's actually interesting too. And this is the sort of the next story I wanted to sort of talk through, and it really underscores why banking reform really matters. And so, I think we know, like we work with a lot of cannabis companies, we know why they want normalized banking, certainly in the plant touching world. But the American Bankers Association released a poll that 3 in 5 voters feel the same way about banking reform for cannabis businesses. But then there were 2 stories that I thought were quasi related. There's a bill that is being considered in Delaware that would ensure, this is a quote this is from the story, ensure financial services provided to marijuana businesses are legal under state law. So, like, legalize banking and provide banking coverage in Delaware. The other, and this was a sad story, that an employee of a Massachusetts cannabis company filed for federal bankruptcy protection. There's no other way to file for bankruptcy protection in the U.S. And just a side note that my father is a retired bankruptcy judge. So this one hit, like, I did send it to him. This is like where our worlds overlap is actually in this story. So a guy that works for a cannabis company in Massachusetts filed for bankruptcy, right? So he's in debt, can't pay it, filed for bankruptcy. What happens is then your debt is basically restructured and it comes to agreement between the debtors and the debtees, the creditors and all that. And the bankruptcy judge said, no, you can't use the money you get from your job at a cannabis company because that money is not federally legal, basically. So it's really screwing up this guy's bankruptcy. But like, this puts into stark, view why banking is absolutely necessary in the industry. Do you think this is the first domino that will drop in Washington, even though we talk a lot about rescheduling?
Well, it's a Kafkaesque conundrum here, right? Where you have somebody going through federal recourse, trying to get out of a situation or restructuring the debt, working for a completely legal state licensed entity, but not being able to actually pay back your federal debt because that state entity is involved in a federally legal enterprise. So what is the, okay, you could say, no, you can't do that, but is there an actual alternative in terms of what's going to happen? No. Right. And that's why you have people that are not necessarily pro cannabis, but you have people that are just pro common sense saying that, wait a second, we need a complete restructuring because it doesn't make sense. There's no actual rule book here, because in one hand, you're adhering to the laws and doing what you're making a living, you're growing a business, you're doing everything you need to do. On the other hand, you're told that you can't do something because of some abstract federal illegality that won't allow that to happen. So I think that continues to be another measure in the momentum of, even in this year with a Republican-controlled Congress or a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, that there's so much momentum because of the complexities and the contradictions that we're going to see something happen on that front in the matter of the next couple of months.
Yeah. It actually, that story of the bankruptcy, actually in the Delaware one too, reminds me of the conversation we had with the folks in New Hampshire that are trying to structure how an industry in New Hampshire would run, following a model they have with alcohol, that the state is heavily involved in the alcohol sales. Could they be a wholesaler of cannabis? Could be a franchise model? Would they be the franchise, or would they have state-run stores? And what is that? And we talked to the advocates in New Hampshire and the lawmakers as well, and they are steering away from having anything to do with any kind of federal anything that regulates the state. But again, it's not a perfect parallel to what's happening with this poor guy who's going through bankruptcy, but it's also not unrelated. Right, you can't get anywhere close to a federal law without running afoul of some of them, certainly from a state position. So,
which also speaks to the agility of the actual operators, that we kind of, we talk so much about how tough it is from a capital environment, but just, Matt, all of this hidden tax and hidden weight that it takes to actually operate anything from a single transporter company in Massachusetts all the way to, a multi-state operator in Chicago or wherever. You have to deal with all of these different things that are just draining from a business perspective. So it speaks to how impressive it is that these companies can actually continue to move, if not forward, at least standing still with all of these headwinds against them.
Yeah. With 3 more stories from 3 different states. So let's start in Minnesota. Minnesota legalized cannabis. Their retail market has not opened up. We talked to Jason Tarasek last week. I can't remember what day. He is in Minnesota talking about this. He's with Vicente LLP. And he's formerly the Minnesota cannabis law guy. And they're going to roll out somewhere in 2025. But there are tribal lands that are going to open up dispensaries as soon as this summer. So we've seen this in other markets as well. So we will start to see people have access to cannabis in Minnesota. It'll be interesting to see how that business shakes out in this sort of interim phase, because we talk a lot about what's happening in New York and like this interim timeline before retail is fully rolled out. So that'll be interesting to watch in Minnesota come this summer. And next to Minnesota, it looks like South Dakota voters may go back, I think, for the third time on a cannabis measure sometime this year. So, the upper Midwest, we'll call it, trying to get in the game, although it does happen slowly. We know what happened in Wisconsin, where it was on the docket and then off the docket and off the docket for this full legislative year. But this is more your neck of the woods. Do we think the dominoes will start to fall faster, or will it be some zones of resistance like in South Dakota?
Well, I think the Minnesota one is particularly interesting because that state is so populated with hemp-derived THC beverages and other things in that category. And so, to an extent, from a consumer standpoint, it feels like it's legalized because you can go into mainstream Whole Foods or other retailers and you can get what looks and feels and quite often is actually cannabis without without legalization. And so the fact that the Native Americans are entering into the market in Minnesota, we'll see what kind of impact that has relative to what we've seen in New York, in Michigan, and in other states that have allowed that. South Dakota, I think that there's going to be, as we've talked about, and we're going to continue to talk about in the national standpoint, continued momentum to get that one across. And I think just the allegory of a state like South Dakota would be equivalent to Mississippi and Alabama and other deep South states, deep red states getting into the action, meaning that we're essentially hitting a plurality of states, ahead of federal normalization.
Yeah, it'll make Sturgis even more fun, probably for the
yes.
bike ride. But I will also say a fairly resistant governor there, who is on the national stage, I think, more or less. I mean, she's in the conversation. Kristi Noem as the possible vice presidential candidate. She is a firm believer and staunch supporter of Donald Trump. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out as well. And one last bit on the news side, and I don't think this is why you're in Florida, but maybe it is. It seems like the court watchers in Florida suggest that this Thursday we might know if the ballot measure for adult use cannabis in Florida will actually go forward in November. Remember, it's being considered and actually appealed by the Attorney General in Florida, but the Supreme Court may rule as soon as this Thursday whether it will go forward in November. It's not the only ballot measure, by the way. There's also an abortion access measure that's being considered by the same Supreme Court for the same ballot. I mean, you can give us a sense, like, you see lots of dispensaries in Florida, certainly, but like, I think this is going to go basically because Governor DeSantis said it probably would. But what are your thoughts as being in situ right now?
Yeah, I think we could use a lot more legal dispensaries, particularly for the tourists here that don't want to take any kind of alternative or deal with the street. I think, to your point, Governor DeSantis believes it's going to happen. It's going to happen. We're going to see this on the ballot. I don't think it's minimized the usage by the population, particularly here in Fort Lauderdale, and they're in the heart of spring break. But my inside point of view says it's going to move forward, and let's just see that come to reality on Thursday.
Yeah, and actually, this has broader implications. I believe it has broader implications. I've shared with your audience when I was on a panel for Grown In that if we were only talking about cannabis, but if cannabis ballot measures on the ballot in Florida in November, and actually an access to abortion measures on the ballot as well, it could have major implications statewide about who turns out, how strongly they turn out and actually impact, I think, the presidential election as well. So we will see how both these things play out as soon as Thursday. If it happens, you'll know about it on Cultivated in your newsletter the next day for sure. Brad, I want to transition. I want to zoom out.
Yes.
Because you and I had this idea to sort of talk United States of Cannabis. Really, I think we even sort of started talking about the end of last year, going into 2024, an election year. But it seems like, and not just because we're in it every day, but like there is a lot happening. I'm going to run down the things that are just always on the top of my head that have just happened in 2024. Pennsylvania governor said they're going to need legalization to actually pay their bills. Florida, we talked about, there may be a ballot measure at the end of the year. I think there probably will be. We had a president talk about cannabis reform at the State of the Union. The next week, there was a cannabis reform roundtable hosted by the vice president at the White House. On the campaign trail, it's come up a number of times, and the president says, I'm taking care of that. We have the Senate Majority Leader saying safer banking is a priority in this legislative year before the election. We have consolidating opposition on the Republican side too, but we also have Republicans that are clearly in favor of certainly safer banking happening within Congress. We have 12 U.S. senators call for descheduling. We have a lot of pressure from Congress on Javier Becerra, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and like, why is it taking so long? There just seems to be a real we have the American Bankers Association calling for it. Like, there is a lot happening. And my theory is that because if you write 2024 backwards, it's actually 420.
That's it.
Okay.
Game over. No, I think in the 5 years that I've been covering cannabis, I have not seen such a concentration of significant events on the federal and state level that is pushing toward this. I think in the teens, people thought about this, and obviously at the beginning of the Biden administration, there was certainly hope with Democratic-controlled House of Representatives and Senate that all of this stuff would be more 2022 issues than 2024 issues. But as we know, in cannabis, things always take longer and are more expensive. That I think what we're seeing now in 2024 in an election year, that Biden is certainly running on the issue rather than, being neutral or running away from the issue. And, particularly the 12 seconds in the State of the Union and Vice President Harris's private roundtable and other things that I know that the Biden Campaign for America are doing to incorporate cannabis executives and investors and fundraisers into the Biden for America campaign makes me believe that, we had our friend Joanne Caceres on a couple of weeks ago. She was on another 1871 / Grown In Cannabis Innovation Summit event last week, where now the pot parlor game is rescheduling, and we're looking for sometime in the late teens of April preceding 420. And, everyone talks about, well, rescheduling is only a half measure. It's not descheduling, but you know what? It's more of a measure than we've ever gotten.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And look, you could be right on policy for decades. And in this case, there are people, but when the policy aligns with the politics, which it appears to be doing right now, that's when the rubber meets the road, certainly on the federal level. And I think there's a story that I just saw flash across my screen. Biden has problems with young people. Let's do stuff on cannabis. And while I think that is politics driving policy, and the policy happens to be right and well thought out as well. And I just think that the stars are aligned right now. No, we said that before. The stars were aligned in 2022 as well. But I think in this case, in an election year where everybody's looking for every slight advantage, whether it's in Florida or other states, this is a winning issue, and the opposition is sort of dwindling and shrinking. And I think the timing is right, as you said. I wish it had happened in 1992 when we arrived at Emory.
That would have been good. I would have gotten in less trouble, although we were still 18. Now, the difference between now and 2022 is like, okay, this is going to happen. Let's celebrate. And then Obviously, the campaign prioritized, or the Biden administration prioritized infrastructure, prioritized other things that it had to pass, and it seemed as if cannabis was a distraction. So there weren't these things happening. There was not a mention in the State of the Union address.
No,
There was not a mention. There was not this kind of coordinated effort by the administration. There was not rumblings or a letter from HHS, and back then, what I remember actually now 2 years ago in the lame duck session at the end of 2022, I remember thinking that there was absolutely no way safe banking or safer banking would actually be in play again. And now we're talking about how Schumer is prioritizing this and saying that it's going to happen by November. And even though we have a Republican majority House of Representatives, it looks like there's a 50-50 shot that this thing's going to actually pass through.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The world has come a very long way, and in the grand scope of a nation, a relatively short amount of time. And I think we could get to the end of this year and have 3 more states, 2 of them very large, actually joining the group, right? Like Pennsylvania and Florida. That would be those would be the last 2 really big states aside from Texas to actually join the fold. Yep. And so, I do think there'll be books written about 2024 in the cannabis reform. Now, does it happen fast enough? No. Does it happen the exact way the industry want? Probably not. But the movement is steady, I think.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, you just rattled off a lot of things that happen in the first quarter of a year. That typically that would be everything that would happen throughout the year. What happened in the first quarter of this year was more than what we saw, in 2023, with the exception of the actual letter going through in early September with HHS and the DEA.
Yeah. Yep. And I don't want to leave, what's happening on the state level either. Shout out to Maura Healey, the governor of Massachusetts, because she is issuing blanket pardons across to tens of thousands of people in her estimation that have been charged with cannabis crimes. So shout out to Massachusetts in my home state and Governor Maura Healey as well. Brad, I'm going to wrap it up. Is that okay? Although I could talk to you all day. Gonna get you back to your spring break in Fort Lauderdale. But I really appreciate you joining for United States of Cannabis as always on Tuesdays. And thank you all for watching Cultivated Live. We encourage you to subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can smash the subscribe button on YouTube. I'll be back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern with my co-founder and editor-in-chief of Cultivated, Jeremy Burke. Remember to buy cannabis at your local dispensary, except you, Brad, because you're in Florida and
you do
that. But have a good day, everybody. We will see everybody tomorrow morning.
See you next week.